welcome to this review of my Pwnage Zenblade 65 keyboard. I unboxed this a while ago. I've given it a fair bit of testing over 3 separate periods by now. It's actually a fairly impressive package in a bunch of ways, though I must admit I really hate the tiny form factor myself, but I know others will love this, and size is just a matter of opinion anyway. In fact, there are not that many Hall effect boards in this small size bracket. One other is the Wooting 60, which I reviewed before, and another is the Air 60HE, which I'll be reviewing at a later date. But in both cases, I've had some macropads to keep me company. In the case of this one, it was the Keycaps Q0 Max, which I felt kind of fitted, considering this is also a big block of aluminium. This one will get a review at a later date as well. Speaking of which, one of the things that makes this one notable is the fact that it comes in a machined aluminium case. Many Hall effect models come in standard plastic cases instead. In fact, it looks like a custom keyboard, including this including this colored block at the back and some fancy machining here and there, as you can see. I must admit that the machining looks very spotless, which is nice. Obviously, with a full metal case like this, the weight is going to be substantial, even if it is only made out of aluminium. It's just under 1.6 kilos sans cable, or if you prefer pounds, divide that number by 0.453592. In either case, that's quite a lot for such a small keyboard. That's more than a Dell Bigfoot, or a bit over half that of a Kish Saver. It comes with Gateron 2.0 Hall effect switches, which are the dual railed ones. I've tested them before and they're very good, super duper smooth and nice to use. They easily wipe the floor with traditional contact based switches in my opinion. Very light as well, same force curve as Cherry MX Red, i.e. 30 to 60 grams, which I like. By default, it's too sensitive in my opinion, especially the caps lock, which isn't stepped. I kept hitting it constantly. However, thankfully, they made the correct choice of creating this keyboard with adjustable actuation, so you can set it to how you want. I think they had it set to 1.4mm actuation distance out of the factory, if I understood correctly. I switched it to 2.2mm, which I think is much nicer. Caps lock all the way down to avoid accidental hits, of course. It's still too much though. I'd love a stepped caps lock key instead, but you know, it's not the worst thing that can happen. Another interesting point is that the actuation can be set on the fly on the keyboard itself rather than being dependent on outside software, which is a good thing in my opinion. It means you don't have to mess around with unwanted programs on your computer or websites that can fail, and it's not like it's a very complicated function that needs its own UI or something anyway. The way it works is you press FN plus tab and then the color of the keyboard changes to indicate that you're now in actuation setting mode, and then you can pick the keys you want to customize, either all like this or individual ones like let's say these 6 for example, and then you press page up or page down to increase or decrease the sensitivity. By the way, those keys along with FN can't be changed, and then you press FN again to exit the mode. Now a cool feature is that the backlight lights up or it dims during these adjustments, giving you an indication of the sensitivity of the keyboard, like so. Basically, I just set it all the way to one end and went from there. It's got full 0.1 to 4mm analog range, by the way, and if you prefer a website to configure the board, that's available too, of course. Another advantage of Hall effect is that the latency is tiny, about as short as is physically possible, and yes, it's also got its own version of the rapid trigger function apparently, which has pretty much become an industry standard for Hall effect switches by now. I haven't tested this myself, but that's mainly because I just play normal games where this sort of latency difference wouldn't really be noticeable. These switches also come smeared with lube out of the factory, so it's all nice and wet down there. In fact, they seem to really double down on the quieting thing, because apart from the aluminium chassis and pre-gooed switches, they also added case foam, and I must admit I kind of understand that, because while Hall effect switches tend to feel really nice, they often sound kind of bad, so by adding all this dampening material you shut them up a bit. So in other words, it's a Hall effect keyboard that does exactly what the modern keyboard enthusiasts typically want. It's tiny, it's made out of aluminium, it's gunked, and it's foamed. So if this is the sort of keyboard you like but want to upgrade to Hall effect, or get a Hall effect that's more in line with your tastes, this seems like a natural fit. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the keyboard was the price. Being Hall effect and full metal, I sort of expected it to cost several chests filled to the brim with gold, but it's actually only $200. Now, of course, you should take into account that this is a tiny keyboard, which will be cheaper to produce than a full-size model, but it's still quite impressive, I think. The least impressive thing about the keyboard is probably the caps, which look like they were dirt cheap. It is double shell PBT, true, but the lighting on them is quite uneven because they're semi-stenciled. So you can see these little mold lines on closed letters like the O and the P. It's much more obvious in real life than it is on the camera, by the way. They did the stenciling on the bottom layer rather than on the top, which makes it less obvious, which is clever, but it still looks pretty crap, to be honest. But at least the lettering on the alpha keys is in the top left corner, which I like personally. Also, you can get them with non-shine-through legends if you prefer that. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised by this keyboard. At first I was kind of regretting saying yes to reviewing this, as my first impressions were that it's impractical and bland, but as I dove into it, I found more and more features that I liked, and the value is pretty decent, I have to say. So yeah, a good keyboard if you like smooth linears and small custom keyboards. Now, where's my battleship? That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.